There's an old saying that the person who lives in a glass house should not throw stones. In other words, if you're going to criticize other people for alleged faults, you better be very careful that those same faults don't apply to you as well. To my mind, that perfectly captures the dilemma of young earth creationists who argue that evolution necessarily leads to racism or that Charles Darwin was a racist. And they try to reject neo Darwinian biological evolution based upon these allegations because those same objections that they're going to raise to neo Darwinian evolution can be applied to Christianity as well. Let's take a look.
Through Darwin's work, he provided a supposed scientific justification for a very particular kind of racism. So he introduced what we call today scientific racism. So in his book, In the Descent of Man, he wrote, at some future period, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider. The Caucasian and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian Aborigine and the gorilla. Pretty horrible stuff that he wrote, right? It led to all kinds of horrible atrocities that took place, where certain people groups who were believed to be less evolved were labeled as missing links or our primitive human ancestors that were put in zoos so people could go and look at them and see this missing link, this human ancestor. All kinds of horrible things took place as this idea started to catch on and people started to do research in order to, quote unquote, prove these ideas.
Okay, let's recognize 100% that Charles Darwin held racist ideas and he sought to apply what would become neo-Darwinian evolution or a theory of common descent through natural selection. He sought to apply it uh, in accord with his racist views. And we should all categorically censure that. And of course, 99.999% of advocates of neo-Darwinian evolution do just that. They censure that. They reject those racist ideas. The problem with the glass house comes when Christians raise that as a categorical objection to reject neo-Darwinian evolution altogether, without recognizing at the outset that the exact same kind of objections can be raised against Christianity. Consider, for example, the historical centuries old link between Christianity and support for racism and for slavery. The story of the curse of Ham from Genesis chapter 9 tells a story of Noah cursing his grandson Canaan, the son of Ham, who then this was used as a justification to say that contemporary at the time African people are descendants of Ham, and thus, just as Ham was condemned to be a servant of servants to his brothers, Caucasian brothers, as it turns out, so African peoples are called by biblical mandate to be servants or slaves of Caucasian European peoples. We today recognize this as blatantly racist, and we repudiate it as one of the historical corruptions of Christianity. That's exactly what a contemporary defender of neo-Darwinian evolution would do with Darwin's racist ideas. Or consider this. This one is even more deeply rooted within Christianity, the link between Christianity and anti-Semitism. This goes back centuries, in fact, 2,000 years, back to the New Testament itself, where you find the Jews being presented as rejecting Jesus as the Messiah, the Jews being presented, the Jews, because often that is the language of the Jews, of being the ones who brought about the crucifixion of Jesus. Throughout Christian history, the citation of Matthew 27:25, for example, all the people answered, his blood be on us and on our children. So the idea here of the historical linkage between Jews having rejected Jesus, Jews having crucified Jesus, Jews being complicit even of deicide or of killing God on the cross, now justifying and warranting racism, anti-Semitism against Jewish peoples for centuries. Linked to that as well was the history of supersessionism, the idea that the Christian church has replaced the Jewish people in God's economy. Two different ways that played out in the early centuries. The earlier one was that God first had an elect people, Israel, and then got rid of Israel and grafted in the church to replace Israel. That's a particular reading of Romans 9 to 11. And then that justified saying Jews now have God's curse upon them. They've been grafted out. The other view was to marginalize the historic election of the Jews altogether by saying the Jews never really were God's elect people, but God's elect people were always selected from a subset of the Jewish people and then on down through history to a subset of peoples today. And then we have negative stereotyping of Jews and the spreading of false views about Jewish religion. For example, the link between Pharisees being these nasty hypocrites and legalists. And this has been led to a centuries old corruption of the Christian understanding of first century Second Temple Judaism by saying this was just a baldly legalistic view. Now, this was an interpretation of Judaism which was shown to be manifestly false by E.P. Sanders and has been rejected widely by scholars today. But it still is dominant within large tracts of Christianity and was dominant for centuries. And this itself justified a long history of Christian anti Semites, people like Martin Luther, who is often praised as the founder, the progenitor of the entire Protestant tradition or movement. Luther, toward the end of his life, showed himself to be a notorious anti Semite. The year before his death, publishing an entire monograph titled The Jews and Their Lies, in which he outlines a process of essentially ethnic cleansing of Europe from Jewry, of burning down synagogues, of meeting the legal definition of what today we would call genocide, the attempt to destroy the racial, ethnic, and or religious identity of a people group. It is this rhetoric which was used and picked up by Nazis. So that's a quick summary of some of the links, and there are many more, between Christianity historically and anti Semitism, and Christianity and racism. Should we reject Christianity because of these historical links with anti Semitism and racism? Or should we repudiate those as false applications of Christianity? And I would say the latter is the obvious response. The exact same thing, however, can then be said for the neo Darwinian, who wants to understand Darwinism as an account of the origin of life and the diversity of species in the basic framework, but of course, understanding with the rise of genetics after Mendel and so on into the 20th century and 21st century, the actual theory has become enormously much more complex and changed in many respects from Darwin's original proposal. But you can still want that and say, but I want nothing to do with Darwin's racist application of these ideas, just like I would want nothing to do with Martin Luther's racist, anti Semitic understanding of Christianity and the relationship with the Jews, or let's say of Robert Dabney, 19th century Presbyterian theologian, his racist application of Christianity in defense of slavery. So again, be careful to throw stones if you live in a glass house. And this is what I want to say to all the creationists who continue to attack evolution because Darwin was racist.